Good morning, everyone. We're just going to give it a minute to let people migrate in from the waiting room and have their audio connect, if you bear with us.
Okay, yeah.
I'm going to ask that everyone mute themselves. We will have time for questions and things like that, but a couple more people coming in. Just give it another moment before we dive in. I appreciate all of you who were patiently waiting in the waiting room. So nice how prompt you can be to these virtual programs. Having hosted thousands of in-person programs, waiting for people to park and walk in and get settled, I don't miss any of that anymore. Okay. Lauren, if you wouldn't mind keeping an eye on that waiting room for us, I think we can begin. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this discussion about the new normal, hybrid pitfalls in a workplace, any place reality that we're living in. I am super excited to be able to introduce my partner, Amanda, who's the CEO of Newance, and will be joining me in this active debate this morning around what is this new next normal. Today, we're going to go through adapting to the changing workplace landscapes. We're going to talk about some of the hybrid work challenges that exist, as well as some unique opportunities that I think often get kind of missed in that narrative. That's, you know what I mean? The sort of like layover of frustration about how much has changed. And then we're going to discuss ways to create more meaning, connectivity, and belonging in workplace cultures. Full disclosure here, Amanda and I are business partners. We're not just two fabulous CEOs, although that is true as well. And one of the most amazing parts about being in a partnership with someone is that we do not always see eye to eye. We have very differing views on some of this stuff. And so you'll see us debating a few of the points that are being sort of propped up as best practices, or at least things that people are trying to sort of improve this workplace connectivity conversation. And I encourage all of you guys to jump into this debate via chat as well. I am certain that you are each experiencing things in your own workplaces and the dynamics that you're experiencing as well. I will say that we have a lot of thoughts on this. We think a lot about engagement given what our roles are, but this is not the end of the story. This is an evolving situation that we're all going through. And so this is our best attempt to sort of forecast how things will evolve in the next little bit. But I wouldn't know, Amanda, I think until they don't, right? There's like a big asterisk on all of this.
Yes, exactly. I think change is the new normal.
Exactly. Okay, so we're going to dive right in. And the first thing I'll say is that while there always tends to be a lot of hyperbole about like, it's the end of the office culture, or the millennials have killed some new fad that exists, I think that I want to ground us this morning in the idea that people are still people, right? Like, I think that a lot of this stuff, it makes for really good clickbait to be able to say it's the end of some sort of times. And, we're not going to talk about how journalism needs to change its funding model this morning, but that is a part of the reason why there's a lot of hyperbole around this. And the other thing that's true is that, we've seen even in the last 22 or 23 months of needing to be more socially distanced, that people still do gather. And so I think that knowing that human beings are social creatures, and that we are eventually probably going to want to be back together, is something that we should sort of like hold in the back of our mind, even if how we work together is perhaps evolving. That said, I want to share some sort of disconcerting facts that are, out in the world now, and things that I think need to be considered when creating a workplace, anyplace policy. And the first is that, is my thing not advancing? Here we go. Only 22% of employees feel like their job fully leverages their strengths. And that doesn't really have anything to do with where they're working. It's just about people feeling like what they have to offer is not necessarily matching up to what is being asked of them in the place that they're working. Oh, I'm sorry, my little screen is not advancing. Can you see my next slide?
Are you good? Oh,
Yeah, I'm good. All right. Sorry, I think I skipped over this one. 28% of employees say that they feel fully connected to work. So you can imagine the inverse of that is that the vast majority of folks do not feel fully connected. And 34% of employees feel that they strongly contribute to the employee's success. And while I think people like to harp on this first statistic about people feeling connected at work, meaning that they need to be physically connected to one another, it's these second two stats that I think really help to sort of frame up this broader conversation that it's been for a while, especially for folks who work in, information-based jobs, an issue that people need to address, and that some of these ongoing sort of cultural issues within an organization, quite frankly, don't have anything to do with where people are working, and rather how people are being onboarded. And we'll talk a little bit at the end about how we sort of view the full talent life cycle and where there might be other inputs for really trying to adjust what your culture looks like before you actually get into some of the policies and protocols around people being separated from one another. That said, Amanda and I have opposing views on all of this. I want to start this conversation by just asking, and you can all chime in on the chat here, as it relates to this new hybrid reality, is this a fad or a trend? And Amanda, I'll have you go first.
sure. I'll do both in the chat and out loud. I think this is a trend. I think this is I think the future of work is not even just that we do work in different locations. I think there'll be even more work that happens in different locations and at different times. So even more distributed and asynchronous work.
I believe, and I think it's because I'm still stuck on that idea that people want to be together and we're naturally more inclined to be together than not, as well as sort of some of this like bigger backlash you see from some of the major institutions around like our culture happens between our four walls. I would wager to say that as things open back up, there will be a big sort of divide around, you know what I mean? If that's your culture, it is your culture, and people will need to be back together. And so in that way, I feel like some of this might fade into that pandemic fad as we get farther and farther away out of it. I'm just going to open the chat here.
I think leaders will try. And I think for the most part, we love systems that we built and systems that we succeeded in. And so if you're in an executive position in a company and you have enjoyed your years getting to that position, you have a lot of fond memories around, I guess I don't disagree that people want to be around each other, but I think they want to be around the people they care about the most. And I don't know if those are always their coworkers. I think people like the idea of having a life where they are gathering, but maybe it's more with their family, with their friends, with, when you look at how much happens in a text-based way for like someone who's in high school right now going into college, I don't think they'd tell you that they don't have a sense of someone via text, right? So it might be that they're still gathering, but they're doing that just in a new way. But I guess I'll add to that I know of many a company whose recruiting strategy is solely to look for companies who are announcing back into the office and to try and poach those people and are having success doing it, right? I think the leverage right now lives with the employee, and I think it's a little less important what the employer wants, sadly, greatly, whichever lens you're looking at it from. But I think that leverage sits with the employee right now.
Yeah, you're probably right from that perspective. I feel like it's been a candidate market for a long time just due to demographic shifts, but particularly in this moment where people have had a taste of maybe some of the freedom that remote lifestyle offers. I'm wondering, actually, could you give us a little bit more context about, we talk about being remote first, or being remote, like tied to a specific geography, I think that would be also really clarifying for anyone that's sort of considering setting a policy and not having this just be sort of like a triaged moment for navigating what comes next in the pandemic.
Yeah, I think broadly people tend to think about remote in the sense of a real binary. Like either I'm in the office every day or most days, or I'm working from, the shores of Greece, or I'm, like we're everywhere. And I think there is a lot of middle ground there of, maybe working remotely, but from certain hub locations so that people can still get together. That's the model we've chosen at Newance. We have people across the US. We'll probably end up at some point with a global perspective. But having people still together, still near each other, still accessible to each other, even if most of the time they're working remotely. I think that's like another way to think of this is, okay, you're remote, but maybe you're remote, but within driving distance, or maybe you're remote, but within a certain amount of space so that, one particularly important thing can happen in person. I think there's sort of shades of remote.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that sort of leads us to this conversation around that gray hybrid area, right? So we have a couple of thoughts about ways to succeed in promoting a healthy, dynamic, and workplace culture, despite having some distance, whatever that distance might look like, and the cadence of that distance. And I would say, again, these are things that are best practices as it relates to promoting a healthy workplace culture, regardless of being hybrid or not. It can be really helpful for you to be able to clearly state what your ultimate purpose is, and to be over communicating so that your team understands what their role in that ultimate purpose looks like. I know at Newance and NEWaukee, we've started since the pandemic doing sort of quarterly relaunches. So we obviously have annual sales goals and objectives as it relates to adding capacity to the team and things like that. But quarter over quarter, we've actually taken a pause to do a bit of a grading of how well we've been doing and a new projection, a new forecasting for that next quarter. And we do that with the entire team with the idea of really truly orienting people to what that looks like. And that the delivery of that actually takes place in an in-person experience. It's sent out, we use a deck. And so we send out sort of a visual component of that. And then we touch base on it on a regular interval in the one-on-ones that take place with direct reports throughout the quarter as well, which might sound a little bit like overkill, but the fact of the matter is people don't all communicate in the same modality. People don't observe information in the same way. And we think that as leaders, in order for people to feel like they belong and they're connected and they know how their particular piece of the wheel sort of fits within that bigger cog, communication, it all starts with over communicating what your ultimate purpose is. This, I think, will be interesting to hear some of your feedback when we get into some of our ideas around this. I personally believe, especially now that I think maybe some of the Zoom happy hour fad is come and gone, that as it relates to activating your employee base, it's more important to focus on belonging and that sense of connectedness and modalities for those things to exist rather than filling activities or just to fill the time. I mean, to Amanda's point, people are perhaps craving more connection, but it doesn't necessarily mean that means they want another Zoom meeting with their coworkers at the end of the day as a way to feel that sort of connectedness. This one I think is really critical, and it's easy to say, but it's harder to really do. And that is that it's important to give your team space to have a voice and to ensure that the ideas that are being offered get materialized in some way or another, or at least feedbacked and communicated as to why certain things are not being advanced. there's nothing like this sort of empowerment that can take place when people feel like their voice really does matter. And when they communicate something that goes from the bottom up, it doesn't just sort of go into a void or some sort of comment box that's never actually considered and reviewed. This, I think, is one of the quickest ways to create that sense of belonging, when people feel like they're actually contributing to where the trajectory of that ultimate purpose is going. And they're being heard in that way. And then I think the last thing that we really offer or think about is how to create trust by having an agreement on how things get done. And this, I think, is particularly important when we talk about some of that asynchronous work, right? It requires a ton of trust to know that you're not going to be schlepping into your office and be seen in your cubicle for X amount of hours per day, right? So thinking through, what are the boundaries of how things get done? As a person who's managing other people, how much of it does it really matter that it's done, in a certain fashion that's XYZ versus ABC? And if there is a particular protocol that needs to be followed, again, how can that be communicated so that while it might happen at disparate hours of the day or in different locations across the globe, there is a sense of how we do things that helps to build that culture. And this can be from the esoteric sense in terms of like a value around, having integrity with clients, as well as a process thing about how we log client interactions in some sort of CRM. Oh, and then finally, this can't be sort of understated. Expressing gratitude, honestly, in a timely and personal manner. This goes a long way, even despite a pandemic. People want to feel appreciated. They want to feel seen. And the more we can do that in a way that feels like a public forum, even if it is like a group chat or on a Slack channel or in a group email or a team meeting, I think the better that people feel like, even though they're not necessarily getting that sort of like attaboy that happens, by the water cooler and in the days of lore, that what they're doing is actually contributing and being recognized by those that they're working with. Anything else, Amanda, you feel like are things that you want to reemphasize here, or, things that work to ensure that people feel like they're connected in a hybrid or even a non-hybrid workplace?
Yeah, I think I would take that having an agreement on how things get done to the farthest level you can. I think sometimes part of really effective onboarding, part of really effective teams is letting people decide, like, and it can be as simple as like, we don't have conflict over Slack, right? Slack is for updates, Slack isn't for decisions. Or maybe we decide a ton of things in Slack and here are sort of norms around that. I think thinking through, what are the things in your culture that are implied? What are the things that when somebody has been there about a year or two, they sort of in their gut know, and figuring out like, how do we make those explicit for everyone is just more important when you're working with some distance.
Absolutely. Oh, we missed one last one. I apologize. I think this can't be overstated, and that is that we have permission to find new ways to be together, even if they are new. And that might look like some of the things we're about to suggest, or I'm curious to hear from anyone that's on the line today, other ways they've found to be together in spite of some distance. So we are breaking this up into 3 sections of pitfalls and what I call discoveries, because I think people maybe, to Amanda's point, remember the way that they came up, there have been a lot of really interesting sort of opportunities that this experience has afforded us that I do think will become long-term trends that affect how we all work moving forward. And the first area we want to talk about is meetings, which I don't know about you, but I think we've all gone through a moment in time now where it feels like perhaps we're taking more meetings than we ever did before. And we have some thoughts about how to do that a little bit better. The first is that more is less. I'm sorry. You don't necessarily need to have more and more meetings to account for communicating, which might sound like a bit of a contradiction in light of us saying that, you need to have some sort of processes, you need to overcommit it. But I have found that we have swung the pendulum, I don't know, a dozen times over in the last 23 months, having been a remote first team. And that this for me is something that I actually like to evaluate on a quarterly basis. I like to look at what's happening with our standing meetings, because it seems like over time people like to throw like, oh, we'll just have one more touch base. We'll have one more thing. And then it feels like we spend the entire day in meetings and there isn't enough space. That said, sometimes it just is easier to get together rather than like spend time poring over a long, long email.
I think one of the ways we do this well that I like is we always try, if we're trying to add, if we come up with an idea of like, okay, maybe we should add a regular conversation about whatever, right? Like the temptation is normally to more, add more. And I think another way to think about this is what can I change something we already have? So I don't know if anyone, like when you were a kid, your parents would, if you got a new toy, you had to donate one. I think that's a good mindset for meetings. Like, try and think about, okay, can we adapt something? Can we get rid of something? How do we avoid just like a huge pile of meetings by thinking of it more as an exchange?
Absolutely. I am a firm believer that after hours Zoom is over, right? Like, spring of 2020, everybody and their mother was like, oh, isn't this fun to drink alone in our apartment? Well, look, we're having happy hour. I just think it was silly and hilarious. And then maybe you ended up tipsy alone in your apartment. But I think that's not how people actually like to socialize, and to have an extra funtivity, particularly at the end of the day, is not going to add to your employees' wellness, or I would argue their connectivity. Amanda, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that after hours part is pretty key. I think when you're starting to, because it was one thing when people were going somewhere and you were giving them dinner, right? But when you're thinking about something like a after hours Zoom, they have to hang up. They've been on a screen all day. Now they're going to be on a screen for another hour, and now they're going to hang up and go make themselves dinner and go do all the things. They've been staring at a pile of laundry for 3 hours. And I guess I should caveat with all of these that, like, if you have a culture where everyone is genuinely really enjoying these get-togethers, like, definitely keep them. I just think it's worth asking if these things are going on and you're seeing participation dwindle, or you're kind of noticing that, like, people are doing a lot of like sighing while they sit there, if they're just really serving the purpose you wanted. But I'm sure there is one culture out there, and there's always somebody in these talks who's like, but my team loves this. And that's like awesome. That's cool. Like, you should do what works for your team before you do anything that we just suggest here in a webinar.
This has been my favorite new addition. So as a part of onboarding, we have made every new team member create a user manual that describes things like how they like to work, how they like to communicate, things about them that they've noted in the past other people think are weird, or perhaps might be unintentionally misconstrued, especially if it's happening in a remote way. Really, it's a way to sort of like get all the stuff you would normally get, you would sort of intuit by bumping into one another throughout the first couple months of starting a job, but it's in a document that's shared with the entire team. And then conversely, the new person gets to read everyone else's user manuals. I think what this really does is not only does it help to like, personify the new team member, right? Beyond the sort of like job description, you need them to hurry up and start doing. But it also is really helpful for direct management, having, that direct manager have a better sense of how someone likes to communicate, when they can sort of expect responses for things. And it's also really helpful for sort of like inter-team dynamics as well. Just knowing that, there is always cognitive diversity on every single team. And so being able to sort of like put a warning out there at, I like to think of it as like creating the rules at the beginning of the game, right? So that everyone understands how they like to be played with. This is one of my absolute favorite things that I think, even if at some point we end up going back to a full in-person workplace, which would be hard for me to imagine sort of doing that now. But even if that was the case, I think this is something that every single company should do as a part of their onboarding.
I want to add to that particular point with the user manuals. I think part of the reason they've been so effective is we created our own with a lot of transparency. So mine describes that I can sometimes be a real raging combination of perfectionism and impatience, and it gives people instructions on if they're feeling like I'm asking too much of them in a compressed time. Like I literally give them words to say to me so that I can hear that that's what I'm doing. And I know you talk a lot about, some of the strong beliefs you hold about work and the world of work. And I think leading with that transparency is pretty critical to the success we've had, and other people being new and still being very transparent about themselves.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's pretty easy to put things like, I prefer to work from 8 to 4, and I like phone calls over emails. In order for this to be successful, I think one of the reasons it has been successful, you're right, Amanda, is that it includes all those quirks, right? The things that like maybe you wouldn't feel comfortable saying in an interview, like, you know what I mean? I am a perfectionist that likes to drive super hard. Like that's not like, your best self, but being as transparent as you can be with your teammates, ultimately allows for those goals to be achieved much quicker, for teams to be more cohesive. And again, we said on that last slide, like focusing on connectedness and belonging, these sort of things matter much more in terms of people's productivity, their efficiency, their sense of connection to the team than the number of sort of, extra after hours things that they have to do with one another. And quite frankly, it accelerates all of that trust because we've asked people to be that transparent on day one, and because people have a better sense of one another without having to sort of like figure that out over a period of time. And then the last thing I think that we've done that has been really interesting is to create extended, unstructured exposure to one another in a regular cadence. And so for Newance and NEWaukee, that looks like on a quarterly basis, we get people together for 2 to 3 days. And there is that sort of strategy charge that I spoke about, right? So we talk about what we've accomplished and where we want to go next. But then there's a lot of free form space. In my mind, it's almost like I want to take all of the one-off happy hours and lunches that we're missing throughout the quarter and create sort of this like space for that sparkle and spectacular fun to take place. And it really is much more fun because it can be concentrated in that period of time. The other thing that became abundantly clear to me, because we just did the one for Q1 for 2022, is I think it's easier in some ways to do strategy in person and tactics virtually. And I know that's not always possible, especially if you're entirely remote first and hybrid is not really what you're doing. But where you can sort of concentrate, strategic conversations that can require more back and forth, that need, more brainstorming or people's true input in where things are going. I think it's just a lot easier to do that in person, even if it has to be concentrated. And I think the other thing that's great about what we've been doing is having it be in that regular cadence. So people have something to look forward to. And they know that that's the space to bring up those sort of like big ideas when everyone sort of seems rushed throughout the week in their one-off interactions that, tend to be timed and have a specific purpose for them. Amanda, I didn't ask you about that. What do you think about my idea about strategies better in person and tactics are better for remote?
I can see that. If you have, I think remote can work. I think you just have to have like a designated facilitator. And I think the absolute worst thing you can do is try to have some people in person and some people remote. I think you all need to be a little box and a screen and I understand that there's like a lot of, new technological things that are supposed to make you like feel like you're in the room. But when 6 people are sitting around a table and 2 of you are on a screen, I really think that's hard to overcome. So for me, it's more about committing in one direction than the other for a particular event than it is about, which is better. I did want to add though on that, like unstructured exposure. I think one of the good things we do is we try to balance in those quarterly ones. Like we'll have like a fun activity, right? Like, but we also, I think, give people like a good amount of downtime. I always find at the end of those 2 days, I'm happy and I'm joyful and I'm still like a little tired. And I think back to like other company events I've done where it was like scheduled every minute of every hour was scheduled for 3 or 4 days in a row. And I just think like the human capacity to absorb and remember is just not there anymore, especially if you have been largely remote, and it can be kind of stimulating to suddenly be around a bunch of people. So I guess I just want to emphasize there that even though we jam a lot into 2 or 3 days, included in that is a lot of wide open space where we'll see some people, reading by themselves, and we'll see other people taking walks and rock climbing together or doing whatever. And I think giving people that space to opt in to what refreshes them is really important.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, so the second thing we're offering to you as a potential opportunity for pitfalls or new discoveries is this multimodal way of communicating. So we've talked a little bit about the quarterly goals. One of the things I personally am obsessed with goals. I'm a very action-oriented person, very type A. I like to have something to always be sort of like achieving. One of the things that we've implemented, actually, I believe that we did this before the pandemic, didn't we? I feel like we did. Is this
we were
idea
just
of like,
before it.
yeah, just before it, that we wanted everyone to sort of set not just like goals like, oh, I want to have this new skill or attend this professional development, but really like defining sort of a word of the year that is sort of their North Star and how it tucks into sort of those quarterly goals. And that can create a ton of momentum. It can help really drive, people feeling like their own, talent development, they're sitting in the driver's seat for that. And it can be really, really clarifying for why things may or may not be changing across this like vast amount of time. Because even though we talk about things in quarters, like as we've all seen, a lot can change in a quarter as it relates to this like global pandemic, both with the economy as well as with the safety and things that need to sort of be updated for how we gather with clients and things like that. And so having sort of that North Star that's communicated for the company and then also distilled into individuals is incredibly orienting for the rest of the communication that needs to happen. Now this, I think, I don't know how it scales. This is a good one to sort of think about. But my very first job out of college, I worked for an international press service that sent teams of journalists all across the globe and had to report into London every night about what they had accomplished. That was their way of sort of monitoring us. And early on in the NEWaukee days, I brought this into a practice with our team because we had so many different events and programs running concurrently. Our pre-pandemic days had up to 200 events a year. And so as you can imagine from a production schedule, it feels like everyone is sort of on a different train track. And what we started with Facts of the Day is an email thread that whoever's logging off first for the day, they sort of do a download of their status updates of their projects, their client interactions, thoughts they're having, things they need. It was a way originally for me to manage our team and have a better sense of where things are at. But in this remote environment has been this incredible way to not waste time during our standing meetings with status updates, which because there are so many meetings and so many things that need to happen, being able to eliminate the sort of like round robin where things are at because everyone follows this practice, I think has been an amazing godsend.
Agreed. We have also started occasionally, we'll put like a small like entertaining question in there, to kick off if we feel like people need to get to inject a little personality into things. I think it's helpful for people. I think what we do a good job of though is explaining to people that, it's not that we're poring over these every single day and you're going to be in trouble if you had like a slightly off day. I think they do read in the spirit of keeping each other informed. And so I think that's important for it to not feel micromanaging. Like, for instance, we never have anything in effects of the day about time. Like, we never ask people, what time did you do this or what time did you do that? I think if you're getting into like, I spent 1 hour on whatever, like, I think it could be easy to tip into a sensation of micromanaging. And I feel like we do a nice job trying to really over articulate what these are for.
Yeah, I agree. The other thing it's good for is being able to, I think honestly, where it's helped us pick up some momentum is because people are working asynchronously. It feels to me a little bit like a baton is passing, like as someone is signing off, someone else can sort of check in and pick up where things have been left off. And so I feel like there's a flywheel sensation around it. It's less about micromanaging and more about really communicating with one another in a way that we can't because we're not sitting next to one another. Amanda alluded to this, but I think one of my favorite things is the new emphasis on group chat and the use of the DMs during virtual meetings. I have found a tremendous, and I don't know if there are any of our clients on here, so I should be careful with what I say, but I have found a tremendous amount of connectivity and sense of camaraderie with our team, leveraging our group chat and the DMs in these virtual platforms to be able to comment in real time about the information we're receiving. I just think it is this sense of like, honestly, it's a little gossipy, like that's the energy of it, which I'm not trying to like promote any like negative gossip, but it's the sense that like we're all on a team and we're receiving this as like a new shared experience and sort of leaning into that it's okay for us to be able to communicate with one another. Now, that said, I obviously would love it if everyone was always, undistracted and fully present in all of our virtual meetings, but I think that's just unrealistic. Like you're staring at a screen that's sending you, notifications, and you're probably next to another screen and another screen as well. But I think to Amanda's point earlier, setting some rules around, what things are used for and how things are done, being mindful of like, don't put anything in a DM that might accidentally get sent to the everyone thing rather than the individual. All of that is really important to sort of be mindful of. But it's amazing to me how much a group chat or these like ways to communicate create more connectivity for me than I think I ever felt in meetings prior to this.
Interesting. We don't really do any of that in like a group chat sense. We, though, on the Newance side of things, we do like Slack. We have a cohort called the Buildery who are getting up and running as tech recruiters right now. And the way we do it is every single week, they summarize their week in either like a GIF or a meme or a single word. It just helps us kind of vibe check everything. And also I think bring some levity and some personality to things. So that's, one of the ways where we use a group chat.
And then I think as long as it doesn't get too, I don't know, trite, bringing some physicality to this hybrid landscape can be really helpful too. And what I mean by that is like, are there little gifts that can be sent out, to people who are not together, or even like resources as it relates to like setting up a home office so people feel comfortable. I think, sometimes it's one thing to say like, all right, everybody, we hit our quarterly earnings, good job. It's another to have that communication come through and something that feels like a real token of appreciation. And, I think this can be overdone. And like I said, it can come off as like a little corny too, but having some way that you can, beyond physically being together, sort of physically touch one another with some sort of kudos, I think that can be really thoughtful, appreciated, and it helps people to feel like they're being seen. All right. I think this is the part that everyone really wanted to talk about the most. The last section we wanted to get into as it related to pitfalls and discoveries is around team building. Amanda, your team does this more than ours. I feel like this would be a total nightmare to have virtual office hours, and I don't understand it. Please tell us how your team uses it and why they like it.
Yes, I will explain them, and I'll also start by saying this is something that came from the team that they organize and they do. I think this would be less successful had I come to the team and said, I think we should all log on at the same time. I'm not sure. I just think that would have changed the tone and the tenor. Our team said, hey, sometimes, so in what we do, there's something called sourcing, right? So you're looking at different candidate profiles and it's relatively like solo, quiet work. And, you know, for some of our team, they don't necessarily want to work in an office, but they do miss the being able to say, like, oh, hey, how would you handle this? Or like just sort of chat, as the week is ending. And so they hold basically like an open co-working space. They open a virtual room, and I think they do it in Zoom or Google Meet. I don't even know. I don't go to these, and I don't go to these on purpose for two reasons. One, I too am a bit of an introvert, and that doesn't sound enjoyable to me on a personal level. And two, I think I changed the tone of it. And I think that what they wanted was time with each other, not time with me specifically. And so, yeah, they get together and work in that shared space for like 2 hours. And again, people come and go. It's every Friday.
Yeah, I guess I think that's something to sort of note as it relates to all this team building stuff. I think there's a lot of sort of, like I said, fervor around like we have to do something to build our team that needs to be this top-down thing. I think one of the most unique ways to be successful in this is to really listen to what your team is saying they want to do, and make sure that there's both the top-down support of those as well as a bottom-up sort of like galvanization of how people want to be together. I do think having dedicated coffee breaks, comma, like with a purpose, is something that really helps. So whether that's like introducing a topic that everyone talks about, using the breakout rooms within a Zoom channel to give people sort of like more cross-functional, across team exposure to one another, having a guest speaker come in and sort of like inspire people, that can be helpful. I think you just sort of need to be mindful about where everyone's energy is at. And I think at certain times of the year, if productivity is really high and people are feeling extra burnt out, this can feel like just another thing that people have to go to. And so, we've played a lot with our team building exercises. And I just feel like having a big open space for like where it's useful, and then, where we maybe need to take a pause on things, can be really super important. Learning together, I guess, is slightly different from the coffee breaks in that it could involve guest speakers. But I think also what's interesting about this asynchronous space we're in is that you can easily send out podcasts, book club lists, articles that are, you find fascinating. Amanda always sends us trends reports, which people love to sort of like dive into, where you can continue to sort of like learn and grow together outside of the sort of mandated professional development or the training that needs to happen on a job. Can be really helpful for people to feel like, oh, at least we all have the same sort of like context, whether that's like culturally or, within the specific industry or profession. That can be really, really helpful for people to feel like they're a part of that team. Amanda, do you want to describe a little bit about the Buildery and some of the guests you have coming in separate from the sort of training with your new hires?
Sure. So we are right now embarking on a cohort model, meaning we have 4 people who are going through the exact same training and onboarding together. Part of that we do in sessions. Part of that I send out, I call it like read the reading, watch the watching. So I'll send out an article on the topic, I'll send out a video on the topic, and then we'll typically also have a guest speaker. So we just had Dana Guthrie of Gateway Capital come and talk to us about venture capital. I think that does 2 things. When you get to meet someone who's awesome, right? I think the team feels like we're making an investment in them, right? That they're getting to expand their network. And then also that they get to hear from other voices besides mine. And then finally, trying to provide the information in a few different ways. Like for me, I'm not a YouTube person. I don't even know how to navigate YouTube really. And I understand that makes me an extreme minority of people in how I learn things. Like I would rather read it. So making sure that we're kind of delivering the information in multiple ways helps it just be a little stickier for people.
Time off versus more time together. This, I think, could be a little controversial as it relates to the team building exercise, right? Like, I think people inherently think, oh, in order for our team to feel more cohesive, we need more time together. Amanda, can you speak a little bit to what we've done as it relates to this? I mean, we have always had like an unlimited PTO policy, but how has this evolved for us?
Yeah, so to your point, we've always had unlimited PTO and wanted to help and let people manage that for themselves. What we found though is there was sort of a different level of recharged and refreshed when people would come back from like a holiday weekend. So a 3-day weekend where everyone was off. We do have a pretty, and we're blessed in this way, like a very dedicated team. And so I think for some people, when they were off by themselves, it was maybe a little bit harder. They felt like the whole team was continuing to move on things. So we took a look at the calendar and added a few holidays. So the Newance anniversary is an official holiday, for example, with the goal of having at least one 3-day weekend every single month of the year. So we close our office. It will actually be closed this Friday. And it's in an attempt to both give people that space, but also make sure that we're structurally supporting what we're saying when we tell people that we want them to rest and recharge.
Yeah, and I think eliminate some of the like FOMO that might be inherent with people who are like high producing individuals, to feel like, oh, well, it's not that big a deal for me to just kind of like monitor my email on top of everything else, which is not a great way for you to totally rest and recharge if you're feeling like you need to be still online, even though you're not supposed to be. We've sort of alluded to this, but I think finding ways for there to be employee-led interest groups. So we had a new person join our team late last year who happened to be really into rock climbing. And as a consequence, has started like a mini unsanctioned rock climbing employee resource groups with several other members of the team. Where there's opportunity for people to really feel like they can create what it is they want to create. The more is more as it relates to that. I mean, I just don't think that makes any sense. And I think where you can be supportive of that in an official way, maybe even like helping to fund elements of it, or, emphasize that there is permission, you know what I mean, to all go rock climbing before you come to the strategy session or whatever that might look like. I think that's much more important than the sort of like forced fun activities we've alluded to. And then, we've expressed this already around gratitude, but I think more than ever, where you can shout out team members and highlight what's going really well. This was our saving grace in the early days of the pandemic when things felt so precarious, you know what I mean? To just sort of focus on, actually our word of the year for 2020 was good vibes. Really trying to like emphasize like what is actually going well here. How do we just keep focusing on that as sort of the energy we want to put out in the world? And I do think, sort of like spirituality aside, orienting the whole team towards what is going really well and emphasizing the wins, especially when it feels like, oh, the work is really piling up. There's always a lot to do. That can be super motivating and make the team feel like, all right, we're all doing this together. We're all contributing. That said, I don't think you should be overly hyperbolic in this way, you know what I mean? Like Amanda's really good about giving critical, direct feedback, like where things are needed, but and I don't think you should gloss over things that are like, really needing to be course corrected. But the more you can sort of like highlight those that really creates a really peer pressure, everyone to sort of like be reaching and striving for more. All right, well, that sort of concludes our suggestions as it relates to navigating pitfalls and the new discoveries we've made. But we wanted to end by just sort of emphasizing that, I think a lot of people think, oh, we have a great company culture, and they think of their mission, vision, and values. But what we want to leave you with is this idea that, all of those actions that people take do create that lived experience for your employees, and that is a multidimensional thing that goes beyond just meetings, team building, and communication. And so what we'll offer to you is that, as you're sort of evaluating ways in which you want to design your workplace, Anyplace culture, to think about it as a whole journey, right? Everything that starts even with your employer brand, like what is it that you have out in the world? To Amanda's point, for some candidates, it's a non-starter if there isn't at least a hybrid or a remote option available to them. So be thinking about the way that you're communicating that out in the world, what that attraction process looks like. How does your culture come through in selection, onboarding? Obviously, performance management and development is something that people sort of innately know as it relates to this, but that can progress even in offboarding. How is it that you can create a truly dynamic culture that even those who've come and gone from your doors feel like being an alumni of your organization or institution is something they wear with a badge of honor that can obviously help with, future referrals or augmenting your employer brand. I would love to have people either through the chat or unmute themselves, offer any of the other things they've learned, questions they have. Had a lot of things come through in the chat. I appreciate you guys being this dynamic. What else do you guys want to know, or what else have you seen be something that's super successful for you?
I have a thought and a question.
Yes, Glenn?
When I did software engineering at big companies and stuff, there were remote workers. Before the pandemic, it was a weird thing. It went kind of mainstream where everybody's, remote, but now we're kind of going back to this hybrid model. It's more accepted, but it's still there. And what I saw was you sort of forget about the remote people and they feel left out if you don't Zoom them into your hallway meetings. And there's sort of that, am I in the room or am I not? And you touched on a lot of those points, but I wonder if you have any thoughts about just literally forgetting about people, which does happen, unfortunately, or just not feeling that an issue is quite big enough to fire up a Zoom call to include somebody. So you just sort of, the other side of the hybrid just sort of does things excluding people for whatever reason, intentional or unintentional.
I have, thank you for that. I have a pretty firm, I think of this in another way that can be kind of Midwesterny, where like the meeting after the meeting, like I make a really big deal when we hire people that I never want us to be a culture of meetings after the meeting. That meeting, like where everyone sits in the meeting and they nod and they smile and they say everything's great, and then they leave the meeting and they disagree, and that's where everyone's real opinions happen. I think it's kind of a similar approach to what you're saying, like I guess I really think making sure that giving people language to say, we've started deciding something and it needs to happen it needs to happen together. And as sort of like setting those rules ahead of time is important, because I agree with you. I think those little tiny decisions add up and get really frustrating, especially if they're happening often, even if you think it's a small thing for the person who's just hearing about all these changes later. I think it is upsetting. So I guess I in general have really strong feelings about meetings outside of meetings.
Yeah, and I've taken to, I'd be interested to hear any of our staff that are on the line here, whether or not they like this. I've taken to the spontaneous call as things come up, rather than waiting for the next meeting. I mean, I do take more diligent notes than I ever have about like what needs to get added to the next agenda. I think sending meeting agendas, well, that sort of formalizes things in a way that, perhaps, a staff meeting used to have such a formal structure to it. That can be really helpful in clarifying, declaring what's going to be on the agenda so that people can come prepared, especially for our introverts who like need more time to process prior to ideation. But, my go-to tactic has been like, oh, I'm thinking about how this might shift it, and discuss it with them as a way to mitigate any of that, or help with the context switching that, perhaps needs to. And, we have a lot of millennials and Gen Z on our staff who don't default to telephone calls as their preferred modality. And so I find myself coaching them as well when they say like, oh, what do you think I should do about this? It's like, you should call them. So I think that, just being more mindful of that, that's not their default, that it, it is a way to sort of expedite that can be really helpful. Jay asked, do you think Milwaukee will trend differently than cities of similar size as far as comfort with totally or significantly remote? Oh, I don't know, Amanda, you're better suited to answer this, I think.
I think we'll be a bit behind, but I think some of that will be because we do have a pretty heavy manufacturing base. And I do think it's like a very real consideration when you have part of your team whose job necessitates on site, trying to think through how do you hold one group of people to one standard or schedule and another group of people to another. So I just have a feeling that that will happen. And then historically, we are also a city of insurers, and people who like to risk mitigate tend to really like to be all in one room seeing what's going on. So there are, to be clear, a lot of remote opportunities here and remote teams and remote companies. But if you're asking me like compared to other places, I would guess it'll take us a little longer to get comfy.
Amanda wants to know, I'm wondering if you or anyone else have thoughts on implementing a remote first policy while also still expecting that employees are located within a commutable distance of your office. This is a thing that exists, right? Like that you can be remote first, but that you have to be within a certain geography. Typically it's like within a state for tax purposes, right? Like the employer doesn't want to have to pay employment taxes in multiple states. But that is a thing that does really happen.
Yeah, I think that can be a nice compromise and even a nice place to start as well. It still gives you the opportunity often to interview people in person, at least, maybe one step of your process. It gives you the opportunity to, do some of your onboarding in person. That can be a nice way to start experimenting with remote.
Magda, I can see that you raised your hand. Do you want to unmute?
Yeah, thank you. I just had an answer to that because I work for the city of Milwaukee. I'm the Chief Human Resources Officer there, and we started our remote work program last June, which for government entities, as you all are maybe familiar with, it's a big sell for us to do something like that. But one of our issues was, of course, we no longer have residency requirements by state law. But one of the ways that we were able to address some of the, residency issue or trying to ensure that people are still within a commutable distance is if they were in a permanent remote workforce schedule, meaning that they primarily work from home most of the time. The requirement is that they still have to come into the workplace 2 to 3 times a month. And we thought that for most people, that's going to result in not living in California and then, trying to come to Wisconsin every month. So that was our workaround, given the limitations that we have. But that's also something that I think brings some connectivity into the office as well, if you can kind of see some people.
I'm curious, do you have things scheduled around those to sort of like make those an extra draw, or is it that they just have to sort of check in at their own volition?
So for my department, I just had them work with their managers to make sure that they coordinated when's the best time for them to come in. But for me personally, with my direct reports, I did not coordinate in-person opportunities, but I know people have different styles. I just think it's not safe for all of us to congregate in one room quite yet. But yeah, I think there are some that have created some space around that for sure.
Thank you. Mitch asked, do you think companies will really look nationally for positions that used to be held locally? Amanda, what are you finding from that perspective? I think pay is the big issue there.
Yeah, I think we're still definitely, and by we, I just mean the world of work is trying to figure out whether geography should or could or will play in to pay. It used to, obviously, because if you wanted to hire someone in San Francisco, you were definitely going to pay them a San Francisco rate. And that still exists in the salaries people make. I think for most places, they'll start they'll try to start closer. I don't think that necessarily anybody immediately jumps unless you have a reason to want someone in another place, to targeting there. Does that make sense? I think it's really about like targeting your search where it's going to be the most effective. And if you don't have a national brand, or there's plenty of people with the skill set you're looking for in your near geography, that can make life, hiring life easier for you. But I certainly think people will see more national applications, and then, being really thoughtful about where and how you look nationally will be part of it.
This isn't a question, but something I definitely suggest not doing. Martha just put in the chat, we're seeing a dramatic increase in local or remote job postings. And the challenge is there's skepticism on the part of the respondents that there may be a bait and switch, that remote is an option now that COVID, but that it'll eventually switch to local post-COVID. Yes, I feel like please don't be posting things out in the world that are not true to your culture. And, the last thing I'll just say before we have to sign off, I appreciate everyone staying with us for a whole hour, is Amanda and I talk a lot about this. I think there are a lot of, whether they're fads or trends, this tendency for everyone to migrate to what everyone else is doing, but rather, to know that not every single worker wants every single thing, and to truly sort of like own what your culture is not a bad thing. If it really does need to be in person, and you really would prefer people who are from a specific geography for whatever reason, to be honest and transparent about that, so that you're getting people who are actually going to thrive in that environment and who really want to be there. Rather than sort of like buck against what you think you need to be in order to be, competitive or whatever it might be, you will find people who also want to be in that geography. I mean, there's a reason that geography exists and that there are people there, things of that sort. So it's better to be true to what your culture is than to have it be some sort of weird ruse. Well, I thank all of you guys for joining us today and listening to our I would say our theories as it relates to Q1 2022. If we were to do this again in Q1 of 2023, I wonder if any of these will still be true. I invite you all to continue to experiment and to grow your own best practices relate to that. If you would love to pick our brains or talk to us further about ways in which we've implemented some of these strategies and tactics, our contact information is here. Always happy to chat further. Appreciate all of you guys joining us here today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday. Take care, stay safe.
Thanks all.